Hey everybody, this is Arash Durudi, the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Fender. You're listening to Bob Bender with the business side of music.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
Can we get serious now?
One thing that did happen during the 60s was some music of an unusual or experimental nature did get recorded and did get released. Now look at who the executives were in those companies at those times. Not hip young guys. These were cigar-chomping old guys who looked at the product that came and said, I don't know. Who knows what it is? Record it, stick it out. If it sells, all right. We were better off with those guys than we are now with the supposedly hip young executives who are making the decisions of what people should see and hear in the marketplace.
Success in the music business begins with a dream, a vision. This podcast will give you, the listener, the insight and tools to turn that vision into a reality. Meet the industry professionals who work day by day behind the scenes, helping to make those dreams come true. Welcome to the business side of music.
On the show with us today, all the way from Orange County, California, we began a conversation through a mutual friend of ours, Cynthia Landine, who is the founder and general manager of Rock Gods Hall of Fame. And she emailed me one day and said, hey, you need to talk to this guy. He's got some history. So joining us is the author of the book Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, My 26-Year Journey with Edward Van Halen. Steve Rosen is joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Bob. Very happy to be here, man.
I went through this book that you sent me, and first of all, it's a lot of reading. It's a lot of really good reading. You're very in-depth in your interviews with Eddie and his life and everything that he went through, and of course what you went through to write this book. And from what I kind of picked up, it wasn't really necessarily an easy introduction for you when it came to the point of wanting to write this, because you didn't know how Eddie Van Halen was going to take it. But before we go down that road, how did you and Eddie initially meet? That was around, what, 1977 or thereabouts?
Exactly, 1977, Bob. So I had been writing for about 4 years at that point. I've been writing for Guitar Player. I've been doing some cool interviews, Jeff Beck and John Entwistle. So I had done some stuff. By the time we would meet, strictly by accident, one night at the Whiskey, the famous Whiskey A Go-Go in Hollywood. So I was there with my brother to see Cheap Trick. Cheap Trick was recording a live record. And I thought, wow, Cheap Trick at the Whiskey, that's worth seeing. Because typically the Whiskey, right, 77, we're talking about the punk thing. And admittedly, I just was not a punk guy. I didn't get it. It didn't do anything for me. But Cheap Trick at the Whiskey, that was worth seeing. So I'm there with my brother, and we're waiting for Cheap Trick to come on, and there's a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, and it's Michelle Meyer. Michelle Meyer is someone I had known earlier. She booked the Whiskey. She booked several clubs around town. And she knew I was kind of a guitar nerd guy. I was always looking to meet and interview the next great guitar player. So she said, listen, there's somebody upstairs you need to meet. So we walk up the stairs at the Whiskey to the dressing rooms. And we go into the one dressing room, and the Whiskey dressing room is like the bottom of an ashtray, man. It reeks of cigarette smoke, and there's cigarette butts, and excuse me, there's empty, beer cups on the floor, and but it was rock and roll, right? It's 1977 rock and roll. So I see this guy standing in the corner, and the question I keep asking myself over and over is, did I recognize who this person was immediately? So you have to understand, 1977, the band had been signed, but no one had done interviews. There were no spreads in magazines. About the only pictures you ever saw of them were on their flyers that were, plastered all over everywhere. I think I recognized it. So we walk over, and she goes, Eddie Van Halen, Steve Rosen, Eddie Van Halen, Godhead. And when Michelle used the term Godhead, that was her way of saying, this is no mere mortal. this is a God on high, and he's the greatest of the greats. So, and Eddie actually smiled when she said that, so he must have heard her say that before. So, I knew that Van Halen had scored a deal with Warner Brothers. Again, this is 8 months before the first record will come out in February 78. This is June 77. And we just start talking, and I don't know how it came up, but we start talking about Eric Clapton. I was a monster Clapton fan. I love Cream and the little bit he did in the Yardbirds, and John Mayall and earlier blues bands. And we just started talking about Clapton, and Ed was a Clapton freak. I mean, he loved Clapton. So we started talking about Clapton. We started talking about Jeff Beck. And it was just this shared connection, just one of those conversations that, you didn't have to think, well, what am I going to say next to him? I don't want there to be this embarrassed silence. And we just spoke, I don't know, man, it could have been a half hour, it could have been an hour. He runs out of the room at one point, and he comes back, and he's got a pencil, and he picks up some scrap of paper off the floor, and he's writing something down, he hands it to me, and it's his phone number. And he goes, yeah, man, it was really good talking to you. I hope we meet again. And that's where that friendship started, man, on that, accidental night in 1977.
That wound up being almost a 3-decade journey for you and Eddie together. And I have to say, when we first meet artists, and especially at that level where I think I'm safe to say they had really not accomplished anything yet, especially with what they were going to be able to create in their career. And to be able to latch on to each other as you two did you have any idea of the metamorphosis that was going to take place?
Well, you bring up two interesting points. One, I think it's because I met him before he was Edward Van Halen that the world knew. So, as you touched on, so that friendship, that relationship is built around that. It wasn't, even though I was not that kind of a person anyway, but it wasn't that I wanted to hang around him because he was Edward Van Halen, this huge star. It was this guy that I thought was just a cool guy. And here was somebody who knew as much about Eric Clapton as I did, To answer your second question, no, I had no idea. Look, the first record comes out, and I write about it in the book, and I quite honestly say I was completely underwhelmed when I heard that record the first time.
Really?
Yeah, man. I thought it was good. It's like, my God, I've heard so much about this Edward Van Halen guitar player, and this is the guy I met. I wanted to be blown away, and I wasn't. I thought, he's a really good guitar player, but I'd heard guitar players just as good, And let me backtrack just a little bit. So I grew up listening to Jeff Beck and Blackmore and Jimmy Page and Clapton and Paul Kossoff and Trower. So those are the kinds of guitar players I was used to hearing. These guys were all, they were just remarkable. I hear Edward and I go, yeah, it's kind of like, Deep Purple, Shuffle, but Deep Purple does this stuff better. I went back the next day and listened more closely, and I realized what everybody else was hearing. I go, oh my God, Rosen, you stupid idiot. And I think part of me, my feelings about that record were, I was afraid that if I embraced Edward Van Halen, that all of my heroes were going to disappear and that he was going to replace them all. But in answer to your question, I never had any idea that he would become a legend, a cultural icon. I knew that the band was going to be successful. He was too good. There was just too much going on there that they weren't going to be, that they wouldn't sell records, and he would, be recognized as a great guitar player. But to go on and do what he did, no, I never had a sense of it.
You mentioned in your book, and you've written, if I understand it correctly, you've written 7 books on 7 different guitarists. Well, I should say 6 different guitarists, and then a children's book on rock.
That's true.
Yeah, which I want to try and go down that path if I can remember, because that sounds like an interesting read in itself. Did you find yourself, because I'm an old school guy such as yourself, I remember listening to Chicago in the very early days. In fact, before they were CTA, I saw them perform a teen dance in Detroit, Michigan, and I think they were called The Next Big Thing or something like that back in those days. And I realized at that moment when I saw Terry Kath, and he had switched from bass to guitar, and he was a monster in his own right. And of course, then you had his peers like Jimi Hendrix saying that How long did it take you to realize that Eddie Van Halen was in the same category as all of those rock guitarists that you had mentioned and written about?
That's a great question, man. It didn't really take long. I would say after the second record, and I heard what he was doing and the accolades that were coming his way from all of his contemporaries, I thought, yeah, this guy is rewriting everything. And on top of that, the fact that he, had built his own guitar, and that would have been enough had he just built a guitar, but he actually played that guitar. To have it in his head, this Tonechaser part of him, I'm kind of hearing this, what Edward would define as the Brown sound. And then to kind of build a guitar to sort of match the sound he was hearing in his head, or to match the sound in his head with the guitar. I'm not sure what came first, the chicken or the egg, the sound in his head and the guitar, and then that led him to ultimately the Brown sound. But it didn't take long. He just seemed to advance to the front of the pack, and he became the spearhead. And again, there were so many great guitar players around then. But even that being said, he was just leagues beyond them in terms of the acclaim he was receiving and the accolades and the importance being placed on his playing. He was a really rare diamond. And yes, it was because of his playing. But man, it was the person behind all of that, and you really got a sense of that. When he played, I believe that every note he played really came from deep inside. And I'm sure most guitar players were that way, but with Ed, you really felt that, and I think all the fans felt that as well. And that's a rare quality to have.
We're going to take a break, get a word in for a couple of our sponsors who help us pay the bills around here. And when we come back, we're going to have some more conversation with Steve Rosen, who is the author of the book Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, My 26-Year Journey with Edward Van Halen.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Branding. What is it really? It goes by many names: marketing, licensing, and image. When in reality, it's 7 key branding formulas that all need to harmonize perfectly. Mess up just one formula and you have compromised the whole brand build. Dead Horse Branding facilitates all 7 formulas under one roof, building, promoting, and marketing all brands at all different stages of their level. We are a marketing team's dream, and we were built to service talent, artist managers, record labels, independent artists, iconic brands, legacy estates, and startups. Rooted in music and seated across other industries like fashion, various talent, hospitality, authors, interior designers, lifestyle brands, and corporate entities. The 7 branding formulas do not discriminate. 7 branding formulas, all in one swift movement. Sick of beating that dead horse? Come to Dead Horse. Please visit us at deadhorsebranding.com or send us an email to info@deadhorsebranding.com.
As a musician, you have a dream, that vision of what success looks like for you. Though it's not only about the money, money is a part of it. Whether you've been extremely successful or just striving to maintain a regular cash flow, you need a plan. Money Concepts can help you develop a customized plan to achieve the financial stability and success you want. For over 40 years, Money Concepts has been providing holistic financial planning services to individuals, families, and business owners. As an independent firm, Money Concepts and their associates are committed to always represent the best interest of the client. It's really about independence coupled with committed benevolent interest, which means that they can represent your client, not a product supplier. It's not about selling products. It's about helping you achieve success. To learn how this can benefit you, contact John Adams at 737-867-9309. That's 737-867-9309 for more information.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Back in the studio here in Nashville, Tennessee, sitting across the proverbial podcast table from us, because he's in Orange County, California today, Steve Rosen, who is the author of the book Tonechaser. This book obviously came much farther down the road from your initial introduction with Eddie back in late 70s. My question would be, when you started to put this all together, you were obviously putting notes together, but you had no idea at that point that you were actually working on a book. Was it just potential interview footage, the cassette player rolling, or are you getting the notepad out and writing notes? What set this artist apart from so many others that made you want to really create, including what I believe you call the Twilight tapes? What really drove this for you, not knowing at that time you were going to write a book?
I mean, that's a great question. So let me backtrack just a little bit. In 1985, I'd known Edward for about 7-8 years at that point in time. And by 85, the 1984 record had come out. I mean, he was, he's probably the biggest guitar player in the world at that point. Van Halen was one of the most successful bands in the world. The 1984 record, all the hoopla. So I asked Edward, I said, hey man, writers are going to approach you and they're going to want to write your life story. I'd like to be the person to do that. Could I do that? And I thought he would take some time to think about it and, ruminate. And literally 2 minutes later, he goes, yeah, man, of course it would be you. I couldn't imagine it being anybody else. And that was an amazing thing for him to say. And for me to hear that it was just unbelievable. So 1985, I began working on what is going to be Edward's authorized biography. I worked for about 4 years gathering interviews, interviewing, musicians he played with way back in the day, guys who were promoting shows back in Pasadena where the band was from, friends, music teachers, guitar luthiers, all for what I was hoping was going to be this book. Edward was never comfortable sitting down and saying, okay, now the time is right. Let's sit down and you and I do more interviews for the book and let's have the book come out. He always thought that if a book came out on an artist, looked at the artist as if the artist's career was over. I go, Edward, the only person who's going to think that is you. But he was pretty, strong-willed about that. So that book never happened. Our relationship sort of ends in 2003. I think about that aborted book over the course of time. At a point in time, it kind of really goes out of my head. I just think, well, that's obviously I wish it could have happened. It never happened. So fast forward 17 years, and I had been thinking about the book, but there were so many things that really kept me from approaching it seriously. One, it had been, my God, if you go back to 77 or 78, you're talking 2020. I mean, what is that, 40 years or something? I mean, it's like, how am I going to remember those things? Does Edward still matter in 2020? They hadn't done anything for a while, right? Their last record was, I forget, a different kind of truth. That hadn't been out for a while. And then I thought, man, am I really up to writing that book? I mean, he was a legend. He was an icon. He rewrote all the rules. In my mind, I had to write a book that sort of rose up to those levels. It's like I had to be the greatest writer in the world to tackle that. I had to do it justice. So all those things went through my head. So I remember sitting down, and again, I've been thinking about it. And I remember the date specifically. It was my birthday, August 24th, 2020. And I sat down and just vaguely, like you referenced, Bob, I had some ideas in my head, and I just kind of sat down and I came out with what would be the first paragraph in the introduction. And I thought, hey, you know what? That's okay. And I came back the next day, because that's the real litmus test. You come back the next day, and does it still resonate? Does it still read well? And I read it, and I go, hey, you know what, man? That's pretty good. And so I kept writing and just tried to follow my nose. And 6 weeks after I began writing the book, Edward passes away on October 26th.
Oh, my gosh.
Right? So now I have to contend with, what do I do now? Do I keep writing? Do I let the book go? The last thing on earth was, if one person said to me, oh man, you only wrote that book because Edward passed away and cashing in. That was about, I mean, I couldn't even conceive of that, but to have somebody say that to me, honestly, man, it made me nauseous. And the reality is I did start before he passed away. But, I don't know if people were going to believe that, blah, blah, blah. But you know what? I at that point, it was like I'd written a couple chapters. It felt really good. I thought, I need to finish the book if for no other reason than I need to say to myself, I wrote this book. Fast forward 14 months. It's 2021. I finished what will become Tonechaser. I thought I'd written a really, really good book. I thought it was honest. I thought it revealed a side of Edward that no one had ever seen, no one had ever written about. I self-published. I find a printer in 2022. I think it's around March or April. I get the first copies from the printer, and I put the book out there into the world. The response was amazing. And yeah, man, I had written books on, as you referenced, I had written books on Jeff Beck and Randy Rhoads and Paul Kossoff and Tony Iommi, monsters, amazingly original guitar players. So writing about Edward, I thought he belongs in the Steve Rosen library of, rock and roll books.
Was there a particular moment, I like to call them the aha moments, with all this time that you spent with Eddie, taking notes, and just you hung out with him, you two were friends, and just, as you said, you'd sit around wasting time or sitting around getting wasted.
Exactly.
Was there one moment that maybe stood out? And I'm not talking about a performance on stage with Van Halen, but just when you realized that Eddie was so, I don't want to say different, but he was so unique that he set himself apart from so many others. Look, let's face it, there's a lot of Eddie Van Halen wannabes out there who are doing a lot of the tricks of the trade that really set himself apart. But he was one and only. Was there a certain moment or a time that you two were together that you went, I can't believe I'm sitting here, this guy's friend?
Well, to address the last part of your question, honestly, that feeling never left. And, as much as I tried to say, I'm just going over to Edward Van Halen's house today, the other part of me said, dude, you are going to Edward fucking Van Halen's house. And, and I sort of prefaced our conversation, Bob, with the fact that by 77, when I first met him, I had met, like I said, Jeff Beck, John Entwistle, and I had just met Blackmore before meeting him. So, I had met huge guitar players. So it's not like I was naive or I was nervous, but I didn't have friendships with any of those people. So that feeling that you described never went away. And I write about it in the book. And it was hard to, split that person. When I'm sitting there talking with Edward as interviewer and interviewee, I have a gig to do for a magazine. So I have to pretend that we haven't already spoken about all of these things, or that I already know the answers, so you have to be that person. And I had to temper that with not geeking out and not just fawning over him. And every time he would play something, your aha moments, there were so many of them. And no, they really didn't come seeing him perform on stage. Look, those are easy ones to go after. And oh my God, he played so brilliantly that night. There were more the little moments. He was over at my pad. We lived really like 9 minutes apart. I lived in Laurel Canyon. Edward lived in Coldwater Canyon, just a canyon over. And, he would just kind of come over. He would just pop in unannounced, and he'd be there at the door, and he'd have a can of his Schlitz and a cigarette. And he'd come in and plop down on the couch. And I had a couple of guitars in racks, and he'd pull the guitar out, and say, hey, man, you got anything to eat? Got any potato chips? And so he comes over, and we're talking about something. Actually, I think it was an interview. And we were talking about guitar players, and somehow I brought up Alan Holdsworth. I knew that he was an Alan Holdsworth guy. And we all know that he was going to produce Alan Holdsworth's record, which never happened, which was a shame because it could have been an amazing record, I think. And I talk about, Alan has that real legato thing where, he picks, you can't hear the picking attack between his notes. It's like this very fluid thing. And Edward knew exactly what that was. And so he starts to do some legato stuff. And he's sitting down and he goes, yeah, man, he says, I haven't been practicing standing up much, or I could play that, but I'm sitting down and I'm rusty. And by him saying that, he's saying, as if he's making excuses or apologizing some. This is Edward Van Halen, you know, and he could play anything, and every guitar player in the world looked up to him. But he's like saying those things as if he's like defending why he can't play those legato things fluently sitting down. You wouldn't hear many guitar players saying that. And it just reveals so much about that human side of his character. And again, which was always reflected, you know, in his playing. There are other moments when he would just be, you know, what Edward would call noodling. And I have this on tape because, again, it was during the course of an interview. And you can hear him playing. And it's something about he's talking about his hammer-on thing, and I think his tapping thing, but his vibrato bar. And he just whips through like 10 different licks that you've never heard before, that have never been on any Van Halen records. And these are just talk-away things that he's done. And I'm sitting there watching him play these 3 feet away. It's really different watching someone play on an electric guitar unplugged when he's 3 feet away from you, and you can watch the pick attack, and you can watch how he handles the vibrato bar, and you can watch how he frets, as opposed to seeing him up on stage, and now he's got the gear and everything. And yes, it's still challenging, but it's nothing like sitting there, you know, unplugged. And I remember at that moment watching him thinking, my God, he really is an astonishing guitar player. And I wanted to say that to him. And one last thing, with Edward, he didn't like hearing those kinds of compliments. And they were hard not to say to him. And it goes back to me trying not to geek out about watching him play or hearing, you know, one of the unfinished tracks. He would bring over like incomplete tracks so I could hear like the records before they come out. And I would hear a track and a solo and go, my God, Ed, that was just unbelievable. Because I couldn't help myself. I had to say it. And he goes, yeah, you know, it was good. And he wouldn't be mad, but it was almost like he didn't need to hear it. Edward knew that he was a very good guitar player, not in any outside ego way, but he didn't need to hear it. It's almost as if you couldn't categorize him or his music enough to say, wow, what a great solo, because that somehow compartmentalized, you know, what he did. So he didn't need to see that. On the other side of that was the fact he played me, and I forget what solo it was, and it was some amazing solo in one of the songs. And thinking I don't want to go overboard, I go, yeah, it was really good. And he took that, my tone of voice, like, and he said to me, well, didn't you think it was good, man? I thought it was really neat. Again, as if he needed my, you know, stamp of approval, which just goes back to respecting who I was. It was all about respect with Edward. And I know I'm kind of over the road in answer to you, but it was all of those things. It was, yeah, I think he was so much more astonishing than any of us even realized when I hear these little bits that no one would ever hear. And probably some of that stuff are on those tapes and those archives in that library, which may or may not ever be heard by anybody. So
we're going to take another break, get another word in for a couple more of our sponsors. And when we come back, we're going to have some more conversation with the author of the book, Tonechaser, Steve Rosen.
You're listening to the business side of music.
This is Mark Allen Barnett, singer, songwriter, creative coach, and mentor. Are you an artist or songwriter, or a family member or friend of someone who is? Are you trying to find your way through the often confusing world of today's music business? I'm here to help. Over the past 40 years, I've written and recorded hit songs, have had more than my share of live performances, and have seen the ups and downs of the music industry and what Music City, also known as Nashville, has to offer. I'm here to share that information with you. The Mark Allen Barnett Songwriting Tours of Nashville are a one-day to multi-day private interactive workshops developed to help you discover your best approach to songwriting, performing in front of a live audience, along with the correct way to network within the music industry. Our workshops are based around what you need to know. While in Nashville, you get an insight from behind the scenes, Learn about the history of Music City. Separate fact from fiction. And give yourself or a loved one the time of your life. This workshop makes the perfect gift for someone you love who wants to get their foot in the door of the music business the right way. For more information, go to www.markallenbarnett.com or www.musicchoosesyou.com. Remember, you don't choose music. Music chooses you.
Are you a fan of 80s and 90s country? Then check out Throwback Country Music, a weekly nationwide show hosted by me, Britt Jones. I have exclusive interviews with legends and icons that include Grammy Award winners and Grand Ole Opry stars. You can listen to the show wherever you get your podcast or watch it on our YouTube channel or our Facebook page. For more info and access to these options, visit our website at throwbackcountrymusic.com. That's throwbackcountrymusic.com.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Back on the show here, Business Side of Music, Steve Rosen, who is the author of the book Tonechaser. You're 26 years plus, I said almost 3 decades, close enough. Time with Eddie Van Halen is one thing, but I want to drift back to what I brought up originally was you actually wrote a book on rock music for kids. Let's talk about that one just for a minute, if you don't mind.
No, man, I love that you asked me about that because nobody ever asks about that. I'm sure you are as well, or you wouldn't have even have brought up this question, but I'm sure I was a big reader as a kid. I can remember the moment when I learned how to read when the letters were no longer disparate in a word, and it's like the sense. That was a real aha moment for me, and I've been a voracious reader ever since. I think reading is one of the most important things you can do. I don't even know if kids read anymore with online or iPhones. That's a different story. I've always wanted to write a children's book. I've always tossed around ideas. I wanted it to be a rock and roll book. I was making a fictitious characters, things in that, and somehow I was approached by a company called TikTok, English company, and they did these kinds of books. And they said, would you like to write a book on the history of rock? I go, I would love to do that. They go, okay, you've got, 38 pages to write about the history of rock. And it was just amazing. And coincidentally, just the other day, because I think I only had one copy, I looked online and TikTok, I don't even know if they were in business anymore, but the book had been reprinted by a company called, I just reached out to them. The book had been reprinted and I reached out to them, said, hi, I'm the author of The History of Rock, Steve Rosen, I'd like to get some books. And I just ordered 20 books. I wanted to give them as friends, and it was a really good book, so if I had known, I would have brought a copy here so we could look at it. I think I probably started with, like Chuck Berry stuff. Obviously, I talked about the Beatles and the Stones, early 70s stuff, Zeppelin. I try not to make it just about the bands that I loved, but more kind of universal bands. I know I mentioned U2 as 80s bands, but I was looking through it again and I'd forgotten. I actually put a page in there, which isn't so surprising, or a couple of paragraphs about Edward Van Halen, about Van Halen. They were in there, And then there were some more, current singer-songwriters. And I think I did the book back in, God, it's been a while. I want to say 2005, 2010. It's been a while, but I love doing that. And I've kicked around some ideas about other kind of rock and roll books, but just, more to get kids to read. I mean, I've looked at children's books. I'll go to Barnes and Noble, I'll look at bookstores, and I'll see what's available. And honestly, I think most of it is pretty bad. Look, I get a 7-year-old has a vocabulary of 20 words, but it's just always the same stuff over and over. Well, what about I don't know, something musical oriented? Anyway, I love that you asked that question. I really love doing that, man. I would love to do another one.
When we talk about Tonechaser, and it's 65, 66 chapters, if I remember right, it is a very deep read, and you really, I think, encompass the life of Edward Van Halen and the band and, Eddie's time. I want to close out with a question that maybe you're comfortable answering, I hope. I read recently where Alex Van Halen had put up all of his entire inventory of drums and touring memorabilia up for auction because he just said, yeah, I'm just never going to play again. What are your thoughts on that?
My first thought is I completely understand it. My second thought is I think it's disappointing to Van Halen fans who love him and would love to see him play again. Look, I have a brother. My brother passing away, I can't imagine what that would do. The fact that he was so closely connected and saw him virtually every day because of the band and touring, how much they must miss him. Yeah, I mean, selling his gear, I get it. If he's not going to use it anymore, maybe somebody else could get something from it, have a little piece of him. You also have to understand, I think Alex is 71. So, hey, he's done his time. He's put in his time. Yeah, man, I think he has earned that right, Just as a real quick follow-up to that, Bob, Alex did write a book that's coming out in October called Brothers, and I think that'll be a wonderful book. I'm guessing it'll be about all those parts of their lives that we don't know about, when they were kids and growing up back in Amsterdam and, the relationship with the family and moving out here, as young boys. So I think that'll be a remarkable book.
It sounds like it'll be a good companion piece to Tonechaser, if you ask me.
Well, I appreciate that, and I mean, I think it will too. Obviously I'm not a brother. I don't have that blood connection. I don't know him nearly as well as Al does. But yeah, as a friend, it does come from a different viewpoint. And, sometimes you can see things in people or talk to people in a way that family members can't or just never do. So I would love to see it as a bookend piece. That would be amazing for sure.
Before we go, how can people get a hold of your book?
Fantastic. So you can find it on my website, very simply, tonechaserbook.com. One word, tonechaserbook.com. You can also find the book on Amazon, Reverb, eBay, and Etsy. If anybody ever goes to Etsy and you want to buy a handmade purse and put a book in it, you can go find it on Etsy. So, and this is the 3rd edition, which has only been out a couple months, and new cover, expanded photo section. So, I hope you guys go out and get it if you don't have it and you dig it.
Steve, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Bob. Had a lot of fun.
The Business Side of Music is the creation of Tom Sabella and Tracy Snow and is produced by Bob Bender. The Business Side of Music is recorded at Music Dog Studios in Nashville, Tennessee. Production sound design by Keith Stark. Voiceover and promo by Lisa Busan.